All right, let's get back in our places. So, you always balk it when I call us to do this kind of activity, but you do a good job of it. I'm going to tell you, you do a good job of it. I see everyone participating and thinking and taking turns sharing their insights and their feelings and their thoughts, and that's good stuff. It's good stuff. So, now we're back in our places, and I'm going to give you that little tidbit. You can take that little paper home with you, or put it in the recycling. As I walked around, I heard some interesting comments and thoughts from your groups about this passage. But I wanted you to interact with it before I share some of the study around this passage. The story you read has been referred to by several names, such as the faithfulness of Abraham, the testing of Abraham, the sacrifice of Isaac, and other such titles. The story has traditionally been elevated as a centerpiece of what faith looks like. Abraham is held up as a model because of his faith in this story. Now, of course, you remember the backstory of Abraham. If not, let me give you a little review, right? God calls him to a land that he does not know. He picks up everything he owns and he goes. God said, I'm going to show you where I want you to go. And so he follows, right? He's got his wife, and they're childless. And, of course, back in these days, you needed to have, progeny. You needed to have some kids, boy kids. Girl kids don't count. Boy kids, so that they could carry on the family and everything. And they didn't have any of that, right? And so they pray, and they ask God, oh, please, oh, please, oh, please. And at 99 years old, God says, Sarah, you're going to have a child. You know what she did? That's what she did. She laughed. The scriptures say she laughed, just like we just did. Right? But in the meantime, before that happened, Abraham got tired of waiting. And even when he told Sarah that Sarah was going to have a child, Abraham was kind of like, God, don't you know we're kind of old? He didn't have a lot of faith at that time. So he took his concubine, which was a thing that guys had back then, and it was acceptable, and everybody had them. And so he took his concubine, and he had a child with Hagar, who was named Ishmael. And then, lo and behold, Sarah has a child, and it's Isaac. And so, all of a sudden now we have this problem. Read the story. I don't want to get into the details of it, but eventually Sarah gets jealous of Hagar and Ishmael, and she says, Abraham, send that hoe away with that boy. In language a little bit like this. All right, so he takes the boy and he leaves, and it's a beautiful story of Hagar and Ishmael in the desert. I want you to read that story. It's a beautiful story how God saves the life of that little boy who's languishing in the desert. I want you to read that story. Anyway, so Isaac is the son of promise. Isaac is the one, even though Ishmael was born, Isaac is the one through whom the line would follow. So we have to know a little bit of that part of the story for some of this to make sense. So the story by Christians over time has engendered heated debate. By the way, the Jews and the Muslims also have this story. Of course, the Old Testament is really the Jewish scriptures, right? And Muslim faiths hold Abraham as their father too. We have three faiths that hold Abraham as their father: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Right? Those are the Abrahamic faiths. That's why they're called that. Abraham is the father of all of these faiths. Anyway, Christians over time have debated the story, kind of like maybe what you did a moment ago. And they ask questions like this. Really, God? Is this a story of an abusive God? Is this the story of a very misguided and confused Abraham? Is this a story about religious violence at its worst? Or is this a story of faith and obedience to be emulated? Is it a story about Jesus, even though Jesus was not born for thousands of years later? I'm not going to tell you what I think of the story. You have your own thoughts and opinions. I'm just sharing you with the biblical scholars and the debates have been over this passage for centuries and centuries. The fact is, we can't sugarcoat this story. You likely discussed it from a perspective from which you were taught as a young person. But let's be honest, this story is very disturbing. The story is even a little bit terrifying. Did y'all have any experiences like that in reading it?
Yeah.
Trying to get around the difficulties of this story is really tough. We know that human sacrifice was a real thing back then. And it wasn't just the other religions that were doing it. Israel was too. Child sacrifice was a real thing. Maybe this is where some of the ideas then began to shift from sacrificing humans to sacrificing animals, because you know, the ram and everything. Maybe that's an idea of how that shifted from sacrificing humans to animals. We don't know that. That's what some have said. It's not surprising then that as you read on in the Jewish scriptures, our Old Testament, several biblical texts forbid child sacrifice. Forbid it. Even in Deuteronomy, we read in the Ten Commandments, right? The fifth commandment, thou shalt not murder. For Christianity, the sacrifice of the son, here Isaac, has obvious resonance with Jesus' death, that a father killed the son. You see that story. It's very analogous to God killing Jesus' story. That's why Genesis 22 is found in the lectionary for Good Friday, Easter Vigil, Easter Saturday. This story is there. Because Christians early on didn't quite know what to do with this story. So, let's place it in this light, and now it's okay. Let's make it say, like Jesus' sacrifice, and then the story feels much better to us. Let's say this story is about Abraham's amazing faith. For really, which of you would carry your son to a mountaintop, bound with wood, ready to kill him? Abraham, man, that dude had a lot of faith. It's a faith against all odds. It's a foreshadowing of God's giving God's own son as a sacrifice. Set in that light, this passage has become revered in evangelical faiths. Paul heralds such obedience in his writings. Preachers laud Abraham's faithfulness and Abraham's obedience. That God rewarded Abraham with the life of his son back. Oh, you were going to kill him? Now, okay, let me give him back to you now. Now I know because you have passed my test. Let me give you this poor little ram caught in the thicket. Kill that instead. Now I know you have passed the test, Abraham. Doesn't God supposed to know everything already? Why did he have to put a test on Abraham? I don't know. These are some of the questions that this passage, read without our Sunday school upbringing, put upon us. The truth is, biblical scholars are not so quick to revere this text. Honest reflection brings up some disturbing questions and thoughts. What kind of God would put someone to such a test as this? How is it that that child sacrifice and even murder are condemned in the scripture, but God says, hey, Abraham, go kill your kid. Is the analogy of the ram in the thicket and the crucifixion of Jesus so easily connected and accepted? You decide. Commentators, authors, scholars have long debated this very disturbing passage. And some have concluded, most in fact, have concluded this. The idea that God would test a man by asking him to sacrifice, to kill his son, is utterly distasteful. It is quite a horrific tale, far beyond comprehension. At face value, causes a person to ask, is this really the kind of God that I want to be associated with? A God who asks for infanticide? Yet, to go around this awful thought, the focus of this passage has always been placed on Abraham and Isaac. Hardly anybody ever talks about the absurdity of God's request. I can remember as a young person reading this story. Y'all know I grew up in church, and I read this story with horror. My religious teachers at the time explained it away by saying, don't worry, it's a picture of Jesus. It's a wonderful story, a beautiful story. The end. Don't ask any more questions. I bought that for a few decades. But I just can't take that explanation anymore. Me, personally. I mean, really, does God play such games with us like this? And is that really the kind of God I want to worship and give all of my allegiance and praise to? Don't forget the other biblical characterizations of God. Some that Jamie and Susan read to us. Some that we read every week. The stories about how forgiving God is. How caring God is. How loving God is. How gentle God is. How compassionate God is. How good God is. The early prophets wrote that God told people to tell the people of Israel to go in the land and kill every living thing. Man, woman, child, animal, whatever. There are two stories in our scriptures that say that. Hey, prophet, go tell the king that he's got to go in there and kill everything, because I'm going to give you that land. That's what God said to the prophet. Interesting, huh? In fact, one king doesn't do that. King Saul, y'all remember him. He doesn't go in and kill everything. He keeps the sheep because he thinks they have some good value. And all of a sudden, one day, they hear the sheep in the hillside. And God says, Saul, did you not kill everything? Since you didn't kill everything, I'm going to remove you from being a king. I'm not making these stories up. Y'all can read them for yourself. So which God is it? Do I worship and praise the God who is loving and compassionate and generous and forgiving? Or do I worship and praise the God who told the prophet to go in and kill everything? Who told Abraham, go and kill your son. I want to find out if you got what it takes. Which one is it? Do I worship and praise the God who was said to have killed his own son, Jesus? Do I worship and praise another understanding of God? I don't know. I can't answer that for you. Hence, the point of my message today. My question for you today is, who is God to you? Who is God to you? Who is the God that you praise and worship and come here to be in God's presence together with all of us? Who is God to you? How do you understand God? How do you understand the God about whom we speak, about whom you speak? How do you understand the God to whom you pray and we prayed just a little while ago? Who is God that we're praying to? The God of the Abraham story or the God of give thanks to God for God is good? I don't know. Both? Neither? You got to figure this out. Do you know the divine? This is my question. How do you know God? If you only trouble. I contend, you probably contend, that the best way to know God is by experiencing God. By being in God's presence. By being with other folks in God's presence. By reading the Bible, yes, but other stuff too. Other things that bring us to a place of quiet and silence and peace and presence. Taking time to be in prayer and meditation, in discussion, talking to others about their relationships and understanding of God, and sharing our relationship and understanding of God. See, this is faith. This is the faith that is admirable. The one that really knows God, not from a story in a book, but from daily lived experience. Are y'all hearing me? Yeah. And so we wrestle with these images of God in our scriptures. They're hard and they're difficult, and I don't like most of them. But I'm calling us to experience God outside of this, outside the context of a worship service, experiencing God in our own daily personal lives, looking at the birds of the air and recognizing God is there. Looking at the faces of our friends and seeing God, experiencing God in those ways, now that's something I can get behind. That's something that feeds my faith. Not a story in a book written thousands of years ago. I'm not discrediting these stories. Don't misunderstand me. I'm just saying we have to read them with a filter of an experience of God. How do you know? How do you experience God? The divine, the creator. Got to answer that question. I'm done. God's goodness and God's faithfulness. I love that song. Thank you, Mom. Let's stand together as we sing our closing, our benediction. Haven't done this in a while. Let's sing together. Have a great day. 2 o'clock, LSU time.